For your texture study, you're going to want to go outside and pick some materials and textures that you want to create swatches of. And we're going to use watercolor and ink just to get a feel for what the possibilities are with the different media. And think of the materials in architectural terms, so things that you would typically see and be sketching. Think about maybe brick or concrete, different roofing or siding materials. Things like that will translate well to this study. For my purpose, I will be drawing this sponge here. It's got a lot of organic kind of shapes and movement here that I'm trying to replicate in the swatch. So you'll set it up where one column will be your watercolor, the other column will be ink, and then you'll label what the material is that you are sketching. Also, make sure that you're using your really light, the 005 or 001, to make construction lines for your grid, and then outlining each swatch rectangle with a heavier line weight. For the ink portion, you can use a lighter line weight, I would recommend. This is the 02 that I'm using here, and the reason is for detail such as this, you don't want it to overpower your sketch. You want it to represent reality, and in reality, when I look at the sponge, I do see the texture, but it's not as apparent as the outline that I see, right? So that's why we use lighter line weights, and even with just one pen, you can get variation in your line weights by how you're holding the pen, so you can really lightly make some of these nice squiggle lines. And then there's also deeper ridges that if I use a different pressure, hard pressure, I can get a darker line weight there, a heavier line weight. That gives some variation even with just one pen within my swatch. So I just went ahead and went through to represent sort of the lines that I'm seeing here and the texture of the material. Now watercolor, I've set it up so I can show you all the steps. What's really important with watercolor and texture is using your layers. But I do want us to limit layers because you can keep going on and on forever, and usually we don't have that much time to add watercolor layers to our sketches, so we want to be efficient. So think in terms of 3 layers at the most, and the first layer you want to look for is your lighter color. You always start with your lighter color, and then you gradually go from light to dark with your layers. So the lightest color I see here is a really light yellowish, brownish, tannish color, which is my raw sienna that I'm using in my palette. And so I'm going to use my largest brush. That's also a good rule of thumb, is when you're going to make your first wash, use your larger brush and load it up with the water, a little bit of pigment because it's your lighter color, and then I'm going to work from left to right, and see I'm using a good amount of water so I can pull that water and pigment down throughout my swatch without showing those brush strokes. And you can be eager and go ahead and try to add some of your darker tones, and what's going to happen is you're not going to get crisp lines. Because this is now the wet on wet method, that darker brown is just going to spread and plume and not have much definition at all. So that's why it's very important. Wait for that first layer to dry. Over here I have one that's dry, and now I'm going to come through and add some of those mid-tone colors and layers that I see. So it's just a tiny bit darker, a little bit of brown, so I'm going to add that to the color I started with. A little bit more. But I'm still not too detailed, so I'm going to keep using this brush, and I'm going to start making some of those intermediate, larger squiggle openings that I see. And so we're kind of dialing in. You start with the overall and you're dialing into the detail, and then you're starting with the light color and dialing into the darker colors and the shadows. So once you have those, and maybe you add a bit more water to spread it out. And remember too, you can always come back with a paper towel if there's too much happening, kind of dab that up. And once I add that in my second layer and I let it dry, it might look something like this. And then I can come back with my even darker color. This will be my third and final layer. And I want to capture some of those deeper shadows. And this is where you could switch to a smaller brush. It'll give you a better control, especially if it's really fine lines you're working with. But see, I get those crisper edges. That start to really define the texture. And I'm using some tapping, but also just some line brush strokes. And then I let that dry, and maybe again I add a little bit more water. And I'm going to call that my sponge watercolor texture and my ink watercolor texture.